Welcome to the Ecology review for the Ecology test. I'm going to go through this as fast as I can. Feel free to stop, go back, so you can look at everything, fast forward if you're good with something. So here we go. So remember, ecology is the study of the interaction of organisms with their environment. So these living things and non-living things interacting with each other. So remember, biotic means living things, these living influences. Bio means life. When we throw the A in there, meaning not, these are non-living things: wind, nutrients, soil type, sunlight, pressure. All those things that would exist in an ecosystem, had all the living things been removed, these would still be there. So when we look at an ecosystem and look at the world, we look at levels of organization in order to understand how to organize things. So these are like Russian nesting dolls, where the larger group encompasses the smaller group. So we start with the individual, this species. How do they live in their world? What adaptations do they have to eat, to find food, to make shelters? So we look at that individual organism. Now, population is a group of individuals of the same species, meaning that they can interbreed and produce those fertile offspring. The community level includes all populations, so that means all living things. Don't forget about plants, grasses and trees, funguses, bacteria. Those are all living populations. So community level is all the living things. Ecosystems we start to add in the non-living things in that area. So the sunlight and the water, the wind, the things like that. And they start to play off of each other. Definitely living things can affect non-living things. If a beaver is in an area, it's going to create a dam. It's going to change the water flow in an area. Similar ecosystems are our biomes. So biomes have the same general type of climate. So all the deserts. Now each desert could be different in the types of plants it has, or the type of desert. It could be a rocky desert, it could be a sandy desert, different types of sand. But they'll generally all have the same climate to be a desert, and the adaptations of the plants and animals will be generally the same. In the tundra, you're going to have animals that have thick fur in order to deal with the cold temperatures. When you add it all together, you get the biosphere, that place where all parts of water where living things can exist. So it's this shell around the earth. So it doesn't go deep, through the mantle, but it's that level from the bottom of the ocean to the top or upper parts of the atmosphere where water exists in the atmosphere. So the difference between climate and weather. So weather is your day-to-day stuff. So it can change from day to day. But the climate are those average conditions over a long year. And we're really looking at the two things of temperature and precipitation. Whatever amount of sunlight you're getting versus what type of water and how much you're getting, whether it's snow, sleet, rain, fog, all those types of things. Latitude plays a huge part in that temperature. So the latitude of the planet where you are, how far you are from the equator, you're going to get less and less amounts of sunlight. So we have those three zones of tropical, polar, and then we're in the temperate zone. Now, it has to do with how directly you are receiving sunlight. The more direct that you receive sunlight, the more intense it's going to be. Now, because we are tilted on an axis, it does change from time to time. So in that temperate region, that area that's between the poles, right here, we get these zones where we'll have hot summers and cold winters. The zone here in the equator is going to basically receive pretty direct year-round. What that does is it creates that these latitudes all will have a similar type of biome. So we find, the tundra all on that latitude, far away from the equator. We're here in this temperate zone. And that's what this graph shows, is the intensity of sunlight in those regions. water plays a huge role in transporting heat throughout the biosphere. So what happens is, on the surface of the earth, as the sun's rays are hitting the air here, it's warming it up, and so that warm air rises, and then colder air will come in and replace that. Now as that warm air rises, it will start to lose heat, and so as it travels due to wind, it will start to fall again. So we get these patterns that are cycling like this. Same thing happens in the oceans to move that heat around, where it heats up around the equator and then travels and cools off and comes back. This is critical to keeping the earth at a nice and comfortable temperature. When we look at an ecosystem, it goes through these levels of succession, where different things succeed and do well, and then they change the conditions, and other things can come in and take over. And there's a very predictable type of change. The difference is primary and secondary. So primary is the first type of succession to take place. And the key is that there's no soil that exists. Secondary succession is when you already have an established ecosystem, but it gets kicked back through a disturbance to an earlier stage, but the soil remains. So when you start with no soil, it takes a while to build that. And so the first species that come into an area, we call them pioneer species. And so what they're doing is when they grow and they die, they start to add this organic material, which is that soil. So on rocky substrates, beginnings, we have lichen and moss that can exist there. And in the sandy areas, we have grass. So we see this progression. These are the only things that can live there. Now sometimes we can get some crags and some spots where little types of grasses can grow. But for the most part, it's lichens and mosses here. And they start to break that rock down and create these pockets of soil. Here, when we're looking at this beach, we see this sandy area here that is, no life is there. But then we see the soil starts to, the grass starts to hold that dune together. It starts to be able to hold water together. So that progression is very predictable from a bare rock over time to the grasses. And so what's happening is that these lichens and mosses are only things that can live there. But as they live and grow and die, they start to create a little bit of soil, which then they've been so successful that they've changed those conditions that grass can come in and go ahead and start growing. And the grasses do the same thing, and then little trees and shrubs will come and take over. The same thing happens with the dune succession, from the dry beach to the foredune, kind of holding it together, increasing water content, and on up to the rear dune. And what we're doing is building up that soil. So we see here, this is taken at the dunes up in Indiana, and we can see that this is being held together. And so we see this layer of soil right here that's being held together and created, allowing for other plants to grow. You go far enough away from that beach and you eventually get to Warren Woods. So this woods is built entirely on a dune. This soil, if you were to go and dig underneath, not too deep, a couple, foot at most, you would then be hitting sand. So this whole forest is built upon that. Now what we've hit is a climax community where eventually this stable community exists at the end that is the best for using those conditions. It just takes a while to get there as long as it's not destroyed. Secondary succession is when you've got an ecosystem that gets kicked back to an earlier stage due to some sort of disruption. So if we were to stop planting crops, weeds would come up, and then eventually would get to a hardwood forest or a prairie, depending on the type of area. So when we're looking at an ecosystem, we're also looking at matter cycles and energy flow. This is really important. So these blue arrows right here, the stuff that we're made of is constantly cycling around. whereas the energy is entering and being used. I mean, you lose it as heat and heat and heat, but eventually it's all lost. It doesn't return back to the sun. And we see that here. The energy for the ecosystem enters to the primary producers, and at each level, we lose that heat, and eventually all heat gets lost. So the amount of energy available for an ecosystem begins with the producers. They're the ones that are taking this inorganic, simple molecules, rearranging them with the energy of the sun into a high energy sugar, where those bonds, those carbon bonds, have a lot of energy. It will stay there until those bonds get broken. Now the plants will use those own sugars to grow and do things, but then it's the animals, the consumers that come in, the heterotrophs, where they get their energy from a different source, that they will then use that energy in order to live and grow. So that includes the animals, fungus, bacteria. There's bacteria that also photosynthesize, but there's also bacteria that do eat. Know the types of heterotrophs that you have. The types of herbivores, carnivores, detritivores, decomposers. There are other vores. There's the insectivore, frugivore, the omnivore, which eats everything. Now, decomposers are different from detritivores. Detritus is basically all the trash, of the ocean or the forest that falls to the bottom. These things actually eat them. Decomposers are different. They're breaking them down back into their molecules, and that's where we create soil. So a food chain is going to show the pathway of energy through an ecosystem, a single pathway, and that's what the arrows show, the flow of energy. So our producers will be our autotrophs. They're the ones that are creating all the energy available for that ecosystem. The heterotrophs are everything else. So all of this other stuff are heterotrophs. The first thing to eat is a primary consumer, which goes on to secondary, tertiary, and eventually your decomposer. Now we can add arrows from each of these levels to the decomposers. Plants that die that don't get eaten will be decomposed, and that is going to lead to soil. Healthy ecosystems have healthy decomposers, which allow more nutrients to be reused. The food chain is going to, the food web is going to show all the relationships. As you see, it gets very complicated, but they're showing individual pathways of energy through an ecosystem. And so they're all the food chains combined. Now, a healthy ecosystem will have a lot of connections. So like if the squid were to die and we take away the arrows that the squid is involved with, yeah, it does some damage, but that ecosystem is not destroyed. There are other animals that can take over. So the key is that matter cycles and energy gets used up. It's a lot like this water wheel, where the matter sits in these cycles, but the energy flows to keep those cycles moving. So we have some basic cycles, the water cycle. So this between the land and the oceans, the atmosphere, and it's run by the sun. The sun is what is able to evaporate, and then as that moves up, it creates those wind patterns, which moves it somewhere else. Gravity brings it down. As it travels, it brings nutrients. And so we get this nice cycle. Now this is a physical cycle. It's always water. Those do not break apart or anything else. Carbon cycle is different. Here it's as a gas as CO2. Now it's brought into a organic tissue through photosynthesis, where we're pulling it out of the air. Now, carbon is in all of these molecules. These little black dots here are all carbons. Carbon is a basic molecule for all life. And then it gets put back into the atmosphere through plant and animal respiration, so we breathe in oxygen and out CO2. Also through factory emissions, volcanic emissions, and that's where some of these deep fossil carbon cycles get released. Nitrogen is important for us in proteins, the little machines that do everything for us. We'll talk about that later. It's also part of nucleic acids, DNA. So in the atmosphere, it says an N2 gas. It's unusable to be turned into a usable form And this is a more of a chemical type of process where we're rearranging the atoms. It happens through lightning strikes, but the big one is bacteria. These bacteria that are specific for fixing nitrogen into usable forms. Once it's in that system, it gets cycled through the living tissues. As things die, they release their nitrogen, get picked back up again as in fertilizer. Same thing with denitrification, putting it back into the atmosphere. Bacteria are the key. Phosphorus is really important for DNA, again. Also, in cellular energy, ATP is a molecule that is used to provide energy for the cell to do work. Now, this is back to more of a physical with some chemical processes. A lot of it's physical, where these phosphates get turned into rock, sedimentary rock, uplifted, and then weathered, and then there it can be entered into the organic cycle in plant and animal bodies, and when they die, the detritivores add it back in, and then it would get back into sediment and turn back into rock. Now the key is, an ecosystem can be only as efficient as the nutrients it has, and there's always one nutrient it has the least amount. The best way to think about it is this bucket with all these slats, and you could have the tallest slats, but the one that is at the least will set the limit for how much water that bucket can hold. It's the same with an ecosystem. So we see oceans have poor amounts of nitrogen, and fresh water have poor amounts of phosphorus, which keeps the lower limit for how many things can be grown. So when we mess with those, we get a disruption. So eutrophication is a situation in which excess nitrogen and phosphorus are added through fertilizer, and they hit this water. And what happens is we see a really quick growth of plants and of algae. They utilize that very, very quickly. They can load up and grow in response. Now when that happens, those plants flourish, but then they create this layer which prevents the sunlight from getting there. These plants eventually die off, and then decomposers come in and start eating them. And just like us, they use up the oxygen and release CO2. When that happens, with the oxygen depleted, that ecosystem dies, and we get these fish kills. So when we're looking at understanding organisms, we need to understand their niche. Now, the habitat is where they live. The niche is how they live. It's like fitting into that puzzle piece. What do they do to the environment to make their home, to find their food, their waste? And so the key is how much overlap exists in those niches. Whatever overlap there is, that's where we get competition. Now, animals will try to diverge from each other to create their niches, but that's not always the case. That can lead to competition. The more that they overlap, the greater the competition, like we saw with the lions and hyenas. We also see these in these community interactions, different populations, predation, symbiosis, all these things. Every now and then we introduce a non-native or invasive species to our ecosystem. So sometimes it's intentionally, sometimes it's accidentally, but the thing is, the new habitat, when you bring something new, those predators and things that kept it in check are not there. So they normally can outcompete the native plants and animals and push them out because there's nothing holding them back. There's no predator to hold them back. It's holding back the native plants and animals, so they go crazy. We've seen that with the Burmese python in the Everglades. Kudzu was this vine that was in the southern parts of America. Rabbits in Australia. The problem with these invasive species is when they're introduced, we don't really see them. As soon as we start detecting them, they're growing up, but they're getting larger. But by the time the public becomes aware, they're so prevalent, they're hard to remove. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, introduced from boats. they are just growing like crazy. There's no predator to keep them in check. They clog up the lines. They're growing everywhere. Garlic mustard, a plant that's introduced, they produce tons of seeds, and so they just grow and grow and grow. The big one is the Asian carp, this fish, and I think it was just a couple that were released into a waterway, but they grow very quickly. They produce a lot of kids. They get pretty big. They disrupt that ecosystem by eating, the native mussels and fish, the plankton that the other ones need to eat, or the grunts that eat the grass. They change the shoreline. These are also the ones that jump out of the water, and if they hit you, it's going to hurt. But that jumping also allows them to jump over barriers like dams and things like that. Symbiotic relationships are pretty interesting when two organisms start to live closely together. And there's three types. There's a mutualistic relationship, where there's a benefit to both of the organisms. These ants provide protection to these aphids. The aphids will produce a honeydew that the ants like. They may eat a couple of the aphids in the process, but there's so many of them that it doesn't really hurt them. In a commensalistic relationship, well, you get a benefit, but the other one doesn't care. So these plants that live up in the trees of rainforest called bromeliads. This is where we get our vanilla. It's the bean, the seeds of an orchid living up in a tree. So the tree it's living in does not care, does not hurt it or harm it. But the orchid gets a benefit. Then there's parasitic, where one gets benefits and the other one is hurt. We see that with this cowbird, where this is not the same species as the mom feeding it. The cowbird will come and lay its egg in a nest, and these will hatch earlier than the other eggs. Because they hatch earlier, they get more food, and when the other ones hatch, they push them out of the nest, and this mom is just doing her instinctual thing and feeding whatever baby's there, so she's feeding this cowbird, not her own finch babies. So you can practice, but remember, commensalism is good for one, the other one doesn't care. Mutualism, both benefit. Parasitism, one benefits and one is harmed. So when we look at these relationships here, you should be able to read these and determine what type of relationship it is. So you can pause the video now and you can check yourself. But here we go. This is a commensalistic relationship. This is a mutualistic relationship. This is commensalistic. This is also mutualistic. Here we have 4 more. You can hit pause and try yourself. Here are the answers. Mutualistic, mutualistic, parasitic, commensalistic. Again, you can pause and try yourself. Here are the answers. This is a parasitic. This is mutualistic, parasitic, commensalistic. My bad. This was a commensalistic. And again, you can pause. Here are the answers. It is parasitic, mutualistic, parasitic, commensalistic. So that's a symbiotic relationship that is mutual to both organisms, the sea anemone and the clownfish. This is competition between members of the same species for a mate. Straight up predation. Don't forget about herbivory if you're eating plants. Parasitic symbiotic relationship. And a commensalistic symbiotic relationship. So we're trying to look at individual populations. Know the things that change the population size. Births and immigration make the population get bigger. Deaths and emigration make it get smaller. So remember, this emits or gives off, starts with an E. Immigration means to go in. Now, given unrestricted, unlimited resources, populations will grow exponentially. But But that's not the real case. Yes, at a low population, plenty of resources, they grow exponentially, but eventually, as the environment starts to put limitations on them, less resources, that rate slows down. Now, you might overshoot, but it usually just kind of hovers around. Now, the factors that can come into play, we categorize into two different categories: density independent and density dependent. So they depend upon whether we have a low dense or high dense population, or they don't. So the key is that density dependent factors are biological in nature. Whether it's competition for mates, we see that with a higher density. These have a greater impact on dense populations. Diseases. It's easier to pass diseases from member to member if they're in close, high dense situations. The independent factors are those that are usually physical or chemical in nature. They don't care about density. They just do their own thing. An earthquake is going to earthquake regardless of how dense a population is. A dense population does not cause an earthquake, but a dense population can cause increased competition or cause competition for mates or predation or disease. So that just about covers it. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.